Hello and welcome to Code Bytes TV. Today, I'll be discussing how symbol to proc works. Has this ever mystified you? I can tell you it's taken me a long time to figure out exactly how this works. And today, I'll be describing it to you. We'll start with the ampersand. What does it mean and what does it do? And to do that, we'll look at some code. Now, I'm going to start with this simple class that we'll use throughout all the demos in this screencast. All it is it takes an item, saves it, and then yields that item so we can practice with passing blocks around. ToProc simply returns a proc of itself, and we can get a collection if we need that. So taking this, let's figure out what the ampersand does. And we'll just create a new file here, and we'll call it reason for ampersand. We'll require my class so we have access to that. And we'll start by creating a new item of my class. Now, I'll start by just showing how it would work normally. So we have our item and we want to yield self. Normally, you could just create a block here. Let me get the object, close it, and then let's just say we'll put object to item. Now, we'll come to our console and we'll just run that file. You see it returns 6. What it's doing here is simple. In Ruby, you can yield or just call in this method, and it executes the block that's passed in and passes in self as an argument. So getting back to what the ampersand does, we can create a block, or actually a proc. This will be the same proc that we passed in before to the method. The only difference is this is a proc now and stored in the variable and not a block. So now that we have this proc, we can attempt to call the same method, but instead of passing in a block, we'll pass in a variable. So this variable, which holds our proc, and we'll run this. And you see here it raises an exception. Yield self is expecting, it got one argument, was expecting 0. Now, this is where the ampersand comes in. If we preface the last parameter in a function call with an ampersand, Ruby will interpret that to mean the last parameter should be converted to a block. So now that we run this, and boom, it works perfectly. We have successfully called this method twice, once the normal block method, and the other time we're passing in a proc as a variable and then using the ampersand to convert this to a block. Next thing to do is to figure out what the symbol does. Now, before we get right into the symbol, there's one more thing that we need to go over that's hidden from, that's not shown clearly in the code. And that is what happens if you pass in something that is not a block, or not a proc as a last item. So what we'll do here is we'll just pass in my class, using the ampersand to make sure that this variable is converted into the block. We'll just pass in my class. And when we run this again, we'll see it executes properly, and we get this message printed, returning proc. If we review my class, we'll see there's a ToProc method defined on the class, and it puts this returning proc, and then simply returns a proc. If the last parameter is not a proc, and we're using the ampersand to convert it to a block, then Ruby will call ToProc on that object. In this case, we're passing in the class, so it calls on the class. If we passed in the instance, which does not have a toProc method and run this, then Ruby will give us an error. Wrong argument, type my class, expected proc. So Ruby looks for this method. If it doesn't find it, then it raises the exception. Now, the last thing is, what does symbol.toProc return? And the reason I'm saying symbol.toProc is if we pass in a symbol here, then by definition, Ruby is going to call toProc on the symbol and then try to convert that into the block for this method. So when we run this, it runs successfully and returns 6. Let's do a puts here. So it outputs that last item, and we see it ran properly. So the question is, what does toProc return for a symbol? So when you call toProc on a symbol, it will create a proc that's similar to this. It accepts one parameter, then it sends the symbol that toProc was called on as a method call to that object. So this looks exactly like the procs and blocks we've written before. And this is what happens to any symbol that you call toProc on. I hope you can now use this coding convention in your own projects to simplify maintenance and better readability of your code. Thank you for watching CodeBytes TV.